So we gave a bunch of, I gave a bunch of various topics. I mean, obviously they're all related. We want to try and capture them as individual episodes sort of thing, or
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, if we kind of wind up wandering between one topic and another, that's totally fine. But I think, you did, like you said, give a bunch of great topics. And if there's like, if we could make it so that each time we pick like one and that's like our main focus. And I know that there's going to be cross-pollination between that and other topics, but we can pick like one and make that like the big focus, then I think we'll do that. Welcome back to OT After Hours, a podcast about industrial cybersecurity, why it matters, and all of the challenges that it presents. Before we dive into topic, we should probably go around and introduce ourselves. We actually have just one guest this week, and that is Rick Kaun. Rick, you are the VP of Sales at Verve Industrial, if I have your title correct, right?
yeah, effectively. But I mean, sales and OT is more about education and program building. But yes, that is my title.
Brilliant. So why don't you just give us like a quick 30-second blurb about yourself and your journey through the OT industry?
Yeah, sure. And pleasure being here today, Ken. Thanks for the platform. So as Ken mentioned, my name is Rick Kaun. I've been selling or solutioning, helping clients to build programs in OT security for just about 24 years now, 24 years. So doing it before it was sexy. I'm just not sure it's sexy yet, but
Well,
yeah. So started at a smaller sort of vendor neutral provider called Matricon, which is where yourself and I met, Ken.
yeah.
And then we of course got acquired by Honeywell, and I decided I wanted to try something a little smaller. Went back to a smaller vendor neutral in the form of Verve. The other thing about Verve is that it really allowed me to pursue what I think the market needed. And I know it seems incredibly biased for a person to, tout the capabilities of the place they work, but part of what drew me to Verve was what they were doing. And it's something that, I'd been advocating for many years. And so as we go through different podcasts, I hope to share some of those insights along the way. But in those 23 years, literally been all over the world in multiple industry verticals. We've seen good, we've seen bad, we've seen ugly. What I really want to do is hopefully share this. And that's what I do on a day-to-day basis. When we talk to clients, they come and say, hey, I want to do this. It's like, okay, I see why you're wanting to do that and what, but have you thought of it this way because of this, that, or the other thing? And it's 100% drawn from seeing people struggle and other people succeed and how they got there. And hopefully as we go through this, we'll be able to share a bunch of those insights so we can save some of our audience, hopefully, some time and pain as they go through it. So I wanted to bring my sort of global multi-decade experience of seeing people good, bad, and ugly throughout the years, regulatory or otherwise, trying to come to grips with what is, otherwise known as OT security.
Brilliant. Thanks. And of course, I am still Kenneth Kully, now the lead of what we're still working on the final name, but I think we're going to wind up calling it Verve Systems Support, sort of a side team for the operations group here at Verve. We'll basically take over the troubleshooting and some of the maintenance tasks after we do software deployments for clients. But anyways, I'm heading up that team, still forming it out. But just kind of on the relevant personal link side of things, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention two things about Rick going in here. First is that Rick, you are the guy who got me into industrial cybersecurity. Like, I mean, no. I mean, I still remember, being at Matricon, and I'd got hired on there with actually like a sales team, just this little like tiny sales team that got wiped out about 3 months in. And it's like they forgot about me for a month. It's like they forgot that I was even there for a month. So, I figured I was not long for the company, trying to find other work while I was just, sitting there in that office, and then you'd like stuck your head in the door. And if I remember correctly, your opening line was something to the effect of, "So I hear you're a programmer." It's been a ride. And then again, too, you brought me over to Verve when I was looking so that's twice now you've sort of hired me into something awesome. And like you just said, you saw a certain capability in Verve. And again, like I remember that little Zoom call that we had where you were showing off some of the stuff that the software could do. And literally, I just kept saying, I think again and again, it's like, I've been trying to build this, in-house where I was working for the last 5 years.
Well,
and here it all is at my fingertips.
You mentioned that I heard you're a programmer because part of why we brought you up was to build some of the endpoint data collection that you need to make informed decisions, which we're going to jump into in depth here right away.
Yeah.
And part of my plug just now about why I'm so bullish on Verve is they're actually practically solving the problem as opposed to skirting the issues. And again, something else we're going to cover when we get into the meat of it later today.
Awesome.
So in looking at what I sent over, where'd it go? I think the person was talking about something I've seen a lot of that we spend a lot of time educating people on. They just don't seem to get it, is that security is a program, which is not, unfortunately, individual functions. I mean, you need the individual functions of security, like inventory and vulnerability and patch and configuration and lifecycle management. But too many organizations are coming at this from more of an IT perspective where things are specialized, because IT is also homogenous. And so you can make everything Windows 11 and use cloud updates and minimize staff and automate, maximize automation, but you can't in OT. I mean, have you seen, Ken, the ISA 99's patch urgency decision tree?
A long time ago.
Yeah, you remember our old colleague Donovan there? He was on that committee, and it's an interesting flow chart that basically starts with, if I can get away with it, don't do it, right? Like the patch, if it doesn't, if it doesn't affect ICS, or if it affects ICS but there's a workaround, and then
right.
But to be able to answer that, I need to understand the asset's complexity, because the other thing about OT is that quite often an individual system, isn't really standalone. It's part of a communication flow, right? And so you need to understand the asset's place in the process, its impact to the process, its vintage. Quite often we still see Windows XP. I mean, what's the oldest one you've seen lately, Ken? You're in the field.
Lately, XP, historically, and T4.
Yeah, exactly. And so you have all these what ifs and gotchas that mean we can't just look at something like vulnerability in isolation. We can't just look at a list of vulns and say, oh, this is my body of work. We had this with one of our clients recently, 23,900 and some vulnerabilities, which is interesting, but useless, because you're never going to get it to zero, and you're not going to just start at the top of the list, right? So, you put that in front of your client, and what's the first thing they ask is, okay, now where do I start, right?
Yeah.
And if you're not looking at it from, and this is a slightly different perspective from the programmatic, where I'm talking about different disciplines have to be pulled together, but you're going to navigate through 4 or 5 what are otherwise standalone disciplines on the IT side when you say, first show me vulns, and now show it to me relative to the inventory, but from a contextual point of view, like this is a safety system, or this is a perimeter component, or this is a critical north-south communication path. And then you're going to look at it, does the patch exist, and is there guidance for it from DHS or CISA? And by the way, while I'm waiting to apply it, is the system hardened, or do I have compensating controls like backup or whitelisting in place that allow me to defer this risk? And so what we're seeing many organizations do is stand up individual focus and individual function, and they want to know this product versus that product versus this product solely on the merits of vulnerability analysis and how you collect it and how you present it and how cheap it is.
Yep. I, something you said there made me think back to before I started on at Verve. And I mean, you were you were there for part of that too. And some of the way that we would do assessments for clients. And I always remember that a big component of our assessments was that Microsoft security analyzer tool, right? Which would it would do exactly what you're talking about. It would look at an individual system, see what was patched, what wasn't, and then it would sort of generate a list of informational low, medium, high, critical vulnerabilities based on Microsoft's KBs. And this is kind of pre-CVE becoming it was a Microsoft tool, so of course they would focus on the Microsoft KBs, and most Microsoft KBs nowadays map to a CVE, but the scanner never actually gave a CVE list, but it did give that list of, vulnerabilities based and prioritized according to how Microsoft prioritizes them. And it was always an interesting data point, but it was also kind of just by itself useless to clients. And so I remember towards, the end of my time there, it became less about, well, okay, you have all of these systems and they are this much unpatched. It, you mentioned the word context, and the context that we really started to zero in on was, all right, look, we know that nothing is ever going to be 100% patched. That's a given, especially in OT, because no vendor qualifies 100% of patches. But, you have, let's say, 8 operator workstations. 7 of these operator workstations are, showing this same number of patches missing. They're all missing around, let's say, 50. Okay. Except workstation 7, which is missing 300. So, that was more the utility of MBSA towards the end of my tenure at that company was, I know I'm going to find missing patches. What was really useful about it was figuring out what got missed. Okay, you have 8 supposedly identical workstations. 7 of them you've pushed all your qualified patches to. Good job. You're doing great. But that last one got missed. What happened there?
Yeah. Well, and you introduced an interesting concept. We work for a big OEM now, and we both worked for a different big OEM before. And this is not to throw them under the bus. I mean, there's a lot of work to be done in qualifying those patches and giving them to people, and it's not trivial. But I remember the one where one of our end users who relied on the vendor to come in and show them the list of patches, and we looked at the patch list, and it was something astronomical, like 1,200 patches or 800 patches are missing on this device. And the vendor came in and brought their approved list and actually did the work for them and high-fived each other and went home, and they looked later and only 200 of the 800 were addressed.
Yeah.
Now, that's a combination of they don't have time to boil the ocean and do everything. And also, if these other ones don't affect the software that they're running or the libraries that they're accessing, et cetera, or the services that they leverage, then it's not considered in scope. But you, the end user, then have to decide, what do I do with these other 600 of the 800 that are left? And again, well, I walked into a plant manager's office once to do an assessment. He says, "You're going to tell me I don't patch and I don't change, help me." And so this is what I've been trying to teach people or what we're trying to get across is that you're going to have way more risk than you can ever manage. It's going to be significant. It's not trivial, but it's also never going to be zero. So what's your threshold, right? For how far do you need to go? What does that look like? And how do you get there? And the only way to get there isn't necessarily patching everything, because a lot of stuff needs reboots and downtime, which doesn't happen. So what's the second, third, and fourth layer of defense you can put down? And that's where you go from individual pursuit or individual perspective to a wider view.
Yeah, exactly. Because at that point, you're not defending the endpoint itself. You're defending around the endpoint, whether that's, you're limiting access to it, or like you've mentioned, backups, those other, compensating controls. Like you said, it's the term of art that we use in the industry to describe other ways to defend an endpoint that, you're not going to be able to defend with just patches and updates and your latest definitions and hope for the best. Can you capture a backup of it? Can you wall it off so that it can only access the things that it needs to access and nothing else can access it? Can you really, really, really pare back what the user can do on the endpoint? And sometimes you can, and occasionally you can't, and occasionally you just can't get the support that you need to put some of those compensating controls in place. And, hopefully you're not in a situation where you have something running NT4 sitting on a internet-facing network, although occasionally that does happen too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's quite the smorgasbord of what you have and what you don't have and what you can do with it. So the only way to really understand and navigate it, is to have as many indicators at your fingertips as possible. Mm-hmm. There's 2 other ramifications to not treating it like a program that I see. One is the general deployment. We see a lot of organizations that are very much at the beginning of it, and they want to do 5 or 6 or 7 things, i.e. vulnerability plus patch plus, of course, the precursor is understand inventory. So inventory, and then turn on vulnerability analysis to that inventory, and then patch where possible. But then the next possible step would be, configuration management, eventually change control. So let's treat that as 5 different disciplines.
Yep.
And if you run that down the way that this sort of individual functional sort of perspective is, you lose the oversight like we just talked about between them, or it becomes very difficult to navigate between them because it's 5 different systems. But therein lies the rub. If you had 5 different tools, you're also going to be doing 5 different deployment projects, which means resources that everyone's afraid of bothering at the plant or the facility that just don't have time to support IT and actually have a day job as an engineer. You're going to bother them 5 times, the same teams, the same sites with the same sort of remote access or a vendor coming in, etc. You're also going to do 5 different procurement cycles. You're going to do 5 different deployments. You now have 5 different tools you need to train these people on to be able to understand how it works. 5 different licensing models with 5 different, distributors.
And you can't guarantee that they talk nicely to each other, the tools.
Exactly. Yeah, and you could argue you need a 6th tool, like a Power BI, to grab them all together. So now you're doing an extra abstraction layer to try and navigate from them. And so a lot of people, here's the challenge, because IT doesn't have a central dashboard with multiple disciplines, they have experts in each of these individual disciplines, and they're damn good at it. I'm not knocking their ability. I'm just saying the applicability in OT becomes challenging. And so now you've got a linear roadmap that's going to take you 2 or 3 years. You're touching these same and expecting project support and remote access and technical analysis 5 times. You're going through procurement 5 times, and then when you're done, you've got this. I always joke the homeowner, right? You just sort of stitch together a bunch of things and hope it looks usable. And this is now we're into a shameless plug for the way we do things here at Verve. In building that single dashboard with multiple functions, we have clients that have been doing this and recognize almost 7 out of 10 hours are saved. But the problem is 80% of the people we're talking to have never done that program, have never tried to do it manually with different tools and Excel for spreadsheets and multiple people talking. So they don't quite yet understand the pain. And so for anyone who might be listening to this and is on the OT side of things, trust me, your peers have learned the hard way. Let's not reinvent the wheel.
Yeah.
Let's not figure that we'll get there. We'll figure it out when it comes our way. There's a very real body of evidence that trying to do security and risk reduction OT can be very, very intensive and labor intensive and manual, which is fraught with errors and manual effort and very real burning of scarce commodity, which is time. So that's one of the second ramifications. So to me, it's the time cycle and how long it takes you to get there. The third we've sort of already introduced in there, and that's the management and the maintenance. Simple deployment of a simple change. One of our clients is 6 or 7 lithium mines worldwide, and one of the vendors didn't approve the decom patch. And so they worked with IT to look at what the actual change was. And it was essentially a security adjustment, just a couple of registry edits. Now, they could send an email to many sites, which is what a lot of IT practices do. They have a vulnerability expert look at vulns and decide it's important to them. So they send an email to the sites, and the sites now have to figure out how to deal with it. And you get varying levels as you play this game of telephone from the source down to the endpoint of what actually happens and how fast it happens and how it gets handled, right?
Yeah.
Whereas this client, because they had this central visibility across multiple things, they said, okay, let's test this registry edit by applying it via our Verve technology. They tried it. They were able to pick, as you know, nobody has a full lab of everything, so the lab becomes field devices that aren't super high impact operations. Start testing the registry edits on HMIs and engineering stations that maybe are redundant or spare domain controllers. It worked just fine. And then after it baked in, they did a staged deployment to these other sites. Nobody at the site had to lift a finger. And they had absolutely consistent application across every site with a few clicks of a button and a couple of days elapsing between testing and bake-in and verification, et cetera. You extend that to something like uninstalling software, like the removal of Kaspersky in North America.
Oh, yeah, that just happened, didn't it?
Yeah. Well, it's the second wave now. I mean, it's an official edict from the president now, but I don't know if you remember when it first sort of came to light, some of our clients were struggling. How do I find how many copies of Kaspersky I have across, a half dozen coal-fired generation facilities, which are very complex and significantly enabled for technology, but underfunded for staff? How do you get a consistent response to something like that, right?
Yeah.
And people can't people aren't thinking about this when they're buying their inventory tool up front. They're thinking about, let's cross this one off the list and that one off the list. I've got a 3-year plan. My personal target, my boss is expecting, 1/3 of this list to be delivered by the end of this calendar year. So I like your fancy story about a big program, but I really need to get inventory and vulnerability crossed off this list this year. So please just quote vulnerabilities and be prepared to, roll it out for us. and then we get compared to, the lowest bid, single purpose, maybe cloud-based, it doesn't support older than, Windows 2016 type of, view. You lose sight of the objective if you're not looking at it as a program and understanding the environment that you're in. So that what I'm hoping to get across today in this sort of discussion, but it's a slow process, and you don't want to scare people. But if they haven't done it yet, they're not really aware of the pain yet either, right? Mm-hmm. So hoping that we listen to those who've gone before us and dare not to repeat their mistakes if we can.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and I think too, I think you also highlighted a need for sort of that, and not every company that, at least that I've had the privilege of working with, not every company does that. A lot do, and they do well for it, but not every company has really, I think, yet come around to, the idea that you do have to approach OT and your OT security policy and your OT security methodology and your tooling and all of that very different from how you would do it in IT. Because, at some level, it's just a collection of computers and servers and network switches and some other peripheral devices, right? If you look at it from a high enough level view, that's just what it looks like. And there are still companies out there that, would probably like to manage their OT environments no differently than they manage, their front office, at least from a, from a quote IT unquote perspective, right? In terms of how you go about handling patches and updates and even just cycling the hardware, right? And yeah, you don't have any of that you don't have any of those things in OT, or at least you don't have them in the same way in an OT setting as you do in an IT setting. So even just communicating that understanding, that's like almost the first step. But then once
it's interesting you point that out. I mean, I was working with a very large, now regulated industry. And IT was like, no, these are IT components. We'll take care of it. We'll do the work. You guys can inform and observe and consume what we build, but we'll be the ones to design it. Thank you very much. And the context in OT and the lack of context for IT is sometimes stunning, right? Like they were building new domain controllers and converting all of the OT accounts or creating them where they needed to be to their own domain. So they had the ability to, run it without access to the business network should the connection between the DMZ and whatnot go away, and separate set of, users and accounts and et cetera and permissions. So you had a corporate account, and if you were an OT person, you also had an OT account, and they were the mix. And they decided that while they're building a new domain controller, they might as well put some system hardening and some policy in place, not understanding that basic security pedigree in IT, like if this is a critical system, you shall have a banner log on, right? Saying, hey, you're logging into, corporation ABC's critical component.
Right.
You need to acknowledge that you're doing this and be careful. Well, it's a pipeline, 270 locations ranging from Alaska to Florida. And many of them in the middle of rural areas where, corporate ABC doesn't actually have staff. They rely on subcontractors and the best efforts for support. So if you put a banner log on to a device that's been configured to auto reboot and auto log on because it's providing telemetry or flow or rates or pressure along the pipeline, which God forbid should go away or you don't see it, which given recent pipeline leaks mean no data is equal to there's a catastrophic leak, so shut everything down.
Yeah, loss
right?
of viz.
Yeah, so
that's these 15 guys, minutes or less. Like you got to shut down or solve it.
these guys mean well, right? And it's not that it's malicious, but they're like, this is a basic practice. We need to put this in place. Well, yes, except a subset of our assets have this function, this purpose, and it's very much safety related. It's revenue related. It's brand recognition related, right? Like it's not just a Windows box. And by the way, yes, it's server, 2003, right?
Yeah,
so
also that.
Yeah. So, it's funny that you point out that there's an intention, but there's a lack of awareness. And again, it's not, we're not painting the IT guys as the bad guys. We're just saying, look, if you didn't grow up in OT, you don't understand some of the ramifications of these computers and systems and what they do. And so that oversight can be significant in impact.
Mm-hmm. It's I don't really have a great analogy. I mean, I think coming up through engineering, right? And I think of like, all the different engineering disciplines. At the end of the day, yeah, we're all standing around, we're all wearing our iron rings, we're all, quote, engineers, unquote. But, that guy over there is an electrical engineer. That guy's a computer engineer. That guy's a chemical engineer. That lady over there, she's computer process control, and she's an environmental engineer over there. And we're all engineers. We all went through some pretty tense schooling, and we don't have a ton of understanding of what each other does.
Yeah. Yep. Well, it's interesting because that's a great analogy, because you take it one step further, and it's like you've got IT and OT, and we once did a webinar that, IT's from Mars and OT's from Venus, like the play on the men's and women's, how they communicate differently. Yeah. And that's exactly what it is, but there's a commonality between them, and that's the old Windows PC or Cisco switch, right? That everybody thinks, oh, well, it's IT's type kit, so we should probably manage it for you. Well, okay, you probably should when it comes to the mechanics and the security and the features and the functions and the settings. But if I'm going to run the OT, I should be the one to say, look, I know you want to harden it or close these things down, but every once in a while, this device needs to do a broadcast to check in with the mothership. And so you have to leave this port open, and you have to enable broadcast type traffic, because it's a quirk of OT that's not necessarily well documented and certainly not well understood outside of a pure OT engineer. Mm-hmm. And that's where we fail, that heavy on beating up IT. It's actually not IT. It's the mentality of, it's a computer. I can secure it. It's a vulnerability function, so I'll give it to the specialist. I'm not worried about the patch or the life cycle. We'll do that with different departments. That's where the mentality breaks down when applying to OT. And never mind the fact that there's a third rail, and that is all the OT equipment, the actual PLCs, the relays, controllers, and stuff they've heard of before. And yeah, I'm not saying you have to worry about somebody actively compromising a PLC and somehow swimming upstream from there. But you do have critical equipment that have vulnerabilities that could be exploited if something gets in the environment. And those PLCs and relays, these are anywhere between 30 to 60 or 70% of the equipment in these environments. And so it's not trivial, right? And that's where IT really, really breaks really quickly, because they're not sure what those things are or what they do. And that's fine. When I talk about a program where we started this, multi-chapter sort of discussion, it's just about the different disciplines within there. It's about, like, in terms of inventory to vulnerability to patch, et cetera, it's about the different perspectives and the different people that are required to come together to design an appropriate response. And that's really what it comes back to, is what does done look like, right? If you go to a group and you say, okay, we're going to do an inventory, there's a project to get an inventory in the OT space for you. If you have 10 different people in that room at the kickoff meeting saying, oh, good inventory, all 10 of them are going to be thinking, oh, now I'm going to get, this piece of data. And they're all going to have different lists of what they're looking for. And that's right where it starts to go off the rails, right? And I want them to look at it from, well, let's put all of those lists publicly together and build the master list, because today you need inventory for simply understanding how big the problem is. And tomorrow you'll need it to understand what vulnerability tool or approach to take. And then you'll need it for, patching. But eventually you're going to need it for lifecycle management. And you're definitely going to need it for backup and incident response or disaster recovery. And we all know that with thousands of assets in the OT space, not everything gets a daily full and a weekly offsite. We need to have tiers of response within there. And that's something that sort of is different from IT to a degree. I mean, IT does have personal information protection, and, HR and financial databases usually get a little more protection than the average print server. I get it. But it's not as catastrophic in terms of, fundamental safety system or a critical leak detection, data source into the safety team for a pipeline, as it might be on the IT side when, HR can't print off, performance reviews, have to go to lunch and come back an hour later, and then the printer's back up, right? Like it's a completely different impact, right?
Absolutely. I had a thought and it just literally escaped my head, something you said there, but if I can think of it, I'll come back to it. But no, you're right. Like in terms of, and I think we talked about that in a previous episode, was just that, it's not that there isn't an impact. It's not, it's not that it's not a bad thing if you're having, HR issues, or if you're having, like something's amiss with either access to the financials, or, you don't want to lose the data integrity for your financials either. But it is, like you say, a very different thing if, a safety instrumented system, SIS, is unable to respond in that critical moment when it needs to respond, and something that would normally be shut down instead, flies apart with a lot of smoke and explosion and fire and loss of life. It's very, very different kinds of impact.
And it can be a non-event, but still be significant. And the same pipeline company we were talking about earlier, they had outsourced some of their maintenance, and the outsource decided it was time to update some firmware on a switch, and they did and rebooted it, not knowing that it was the conduit for the safety indicators to the safety team. And like you said, lack of viz, they shut it down. That was a $17 million mistake based on lost production and fines and having to file paperwork with the NTSB and diverting engineers to do an incident evaluation, et cetera, et cetera. So absolutely well-intentioned, proactive, let's harden things, secure things, keep things up to date, but without the context and the environment. And nobody got hurt. Nothing got broken. All the product was still there. But this is a pretty significant oops, right, in terms of time and money wasted on that particular lack of oversight. So, it goes to, like you said, it goes to bigger safety issues. I mean, Texas City, BP, I mean, it wasn't nefarious or cyber, but it was people ignoring alarms. So ignoring is the same as not getting if you're not going to act or whatever, right? And so I don't want to do FUD here, but I mean, it's there's lots of big impacts potentially out there, and some are monetary, but some are safety as well. And it's a multi-discipline, multi-perspective to be able to fight the good fight, and the only way to do that is to bring as much of that data together, but also bring multiple perspectives and skill sets together as well. Like you gave the analogy of the different engineers.
Yeah. And it is, it's finding those skill sets that's, maybe a trick in OT. And a lot of that time is just because, where's the budget for it, right? I mean, I tell I have my little, character of Bob the engineer that I've introduced, I think, a couple of times on the show already, right? And he's the guy that, he's the plant, whether I've met this guy many, many times, right? He's the plant, he's the NERCSIP technical contact, or he's the, the OT technical person, right? And really he's an electrician, and that's, really all he wants to be in the plant is just, going back to swapping out the fluorescent light bulbs and working on the electricals and not messing with all this computer stuff. But he made the mistake one time of helping out the plant manager because his son happened to fix a problem on his computer, and the plant manager had the same problem, and Bob remembered what his son did, so he told the plant manager to do that. And wow, Bob, you're a computer genius. And you are now our, plant NERCSIP technical contact, or whatever the case may be. It's not, he's one guy, and it's not his forte to begin with. And he doesn't, but there's no budget for him to have that, squad of more technical people to handle those functions. There's just him. Yep.
Yeah, that's often the challenge. Lack of staff, right? And so, it goes back to that. Again, the programmatic approach is, what does maintenance look like, and who's going to do it and how? And, not just what does it look like, but the example of the client editing the registry instead of waiting for the patch. I mean, that's a deviation from what IT would typically think of doing. At least not always, but it's not necessarily a first step. I mean, in this case, it was the vendor doesn't approve, so we stopped in our tracks and live with it, which is what they used to do. Or, well, what is it that it's actually doing? And now you're talking, to your point, Bob, the engineer, doesn't know what the security release says. You need to bring in IT for that. You need a different skill set to say, oh, well, you have this problem. Well, here's what it means. And then Bob, the engineer who knows the system, says, well, we could probably make those changes. I can give you a couple of target devices to test it on. And suddenly we're not stuck on zero, right? And that's, but again,
it's dialogue there.
Yeah. But the dialogue is fed and succeeds or fails based on the context that you're able to provide it.
Yep.
Okay. I think I have what I want for today anyway. I don't know if you want to go deeper. Brilliant. But that's almost an hour of two different topics. So
yeah, and I'm going to have a mental debate with myself whether I want to split that into 2 episodes or just keep it as one. I think it could work as both. But until next time, this has been OT After Hours, a podcast about industrial cybersecurity. Feel free to reach out to us on LinkedIn. You can either reach out to Verve directly on LinkedIn or to myself. Happy to hear from you either way, because it does matter, and we would like to help you get through those challenges.